Thanks for joining us tonight. Debt ceiling limits are virtuous, not reckless. That is the topic of tonight's byline. Non-essential services of the U.S. government are still in shutdown mode due to the Republicans voting against a temporary spending bill involving Obamacare. Of course, this is not solely about Obamacare. It's bigger than that. It's about the October 17th deadline to raise the debt ceiling limit once again. Republicans elected as fiscal conservatives are tired of watching government continually grow. U.S. debt is currently 75% of GDP and is predicted to hit 100% in 25 years. The entire reason, folks, that there is a debt ceiling to be voted on is so politicians have to make a conscious effort to go over it. It's not a good thing. It shouldn't be a routine thing either. Yet now it's just expected, oh, you there, sign here on the dotted line. But trying to keep under the limit is the virtuous response to it. But you wouldn't know that reading the mainstream media. All you hear about are reports of reckless Republicans. But aren't the reckless ones the politicians who continually refuse to restrain government? Which brings us to Canada. Writing in the Sun Media newspapers Wednesday, I argued Canada needs a debt ceiling. Now, when it comes to Obamacare, the bill has already been passed. The Supreme Court even gave it the thumbs up. But they were addressing the content and the spirit of the bill. They weren't addressing the price tag. Now, in America, it pretty much goes that politicians can pass bills, but then they have to go back and separately approve the money to finance all that stuff. In Canada, we pass the budget bills you hear about, but, well, they're not just about the budget. They got other stuff in them. So we usually publicly debate the policy stuff rather than that price tag, that fine print. Only as an afterthought, do we look back and realize, oh, wow, our debt ceiling just went up. Right now, we're at a record $618 billion. Now, if we actually had to vote to raise the debt ceiling specifically, well, then it would become a matter of public debate. Now, it's largely ignored, out of sight, out of mind, which is a problem when you're talking about committing Canadians and their grandchildren to increased debt servicing costs, and so forth. Huffington Post columnist Michael Boland thinks I'm wrong in a column headlined, "Canada needs to be more like the U.S., like it needs a hole in the head." Boland calls me out for my suggestion. He says the U.S. is a dystopian democracy simply because politicians, it seems, aren't rubber stamping money bills like sheep. We'll have Mr. Boland on in a moment. I don't think people finally taking a stand against the perpetual government growth machine is dystopian. In fact, if anything's dystopian, I think it's unsustainable growth, particularly when it's half hidden from the public. Look, the Canadian public deserve to know and have a say when government debt is being moved up a notch, even if it's just a notch. They deserve to have a say. It's their money after all. Debt ceiling limits, folks, are the morally superior way of governing. And that's the byline.
And there's one way out of this reckless and damaging Republican shutdown. Congress has to pass a budget that funds our government with no partisan strings attached. There will be no negotiations over this. The American people are not pawns in some political game.
All right, let's go to our Toronto studio now, where Huffington Post editor and columnist Michael Boland joins us. All right, Mr. Boland, help explain to me why you would counter that it's not a good thing to have some sort of lever, some sort of mechanism to force politicians to actually address rising debt.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thanks for having me on the program tonight.
Thanks for being here.
I think the reason why a debt ceiling is a bad idea is, first off, it hasn't worked in the United States to restrain debt at all. They've had this debt ceiling for quite some time, and as you said, they continue to raise it anyway. Secondly, it's encouraged the sort of perpetual crisis politics that we're seeing in the United States right now. As this debt ceiling approaches, you'll see the Republicans ramping up the rhetoric again. And the threat of a default on America's debt payments is bad for the economy. It's bad for the image of the nation. It's bad for their credit rating. It's just all around bad. So, I mean, the debt ceiling hasn't worked for America, and I certainly don't think it would work for Canada either.
What do you mean by rhetoric, though? Do you mean that they're just telling bald-faced lies, or that they're saying we really want to talk about this issue and you guys aren't talking about this issue? Because that's what it is to me.
No, I think debt certainly is an issue, and Obamacare certainly has a relationship to debt in the sense that over the long term, it should help to reduce America's costs. Healthcare is a runaway spending issue in the United States, and America truly does have a real issue with addressing the cost of entitlements. But I think what would be responsible is for the Republicans and Democrats to sit down together and make some rational long-term decisions about where they could cut entitlement spending to bring the debt under control over the long term.
But that's been tried before. That's what they sat down to do the last time they were at this impasse and the time before. And clearly, the people who were newly elected to restrain government growth, that's what they campaigned on, that's what they were elected for. They feel like that's not what we're getting here. I mean, I think if someone's saying, okay, we got to increase things by $10 billion, and you think even $1 billion is too much, well, $5 billion is not a compromise. Meeting halfway sometimes violates the whole reason that you got into office in the first place. I don't see that as reckless.
I think that just shutting down spending completely will simply do the opposite of what they intend to do. By shutting down government spending drastically, as they did with the sequester, say, you'll see an actual drop in growth in the economy. And that drop in growth will cause less tax revenue to be collected. And you'll actually see a bigger deficit problem for the United States than you would have seen if they had simply passed the debt ceiling and spent some time thinking about long-term solutions to their debt problems, which Obamacare begins to address.
Okay, I'd like to talk more about American politics, but I want to get back to the Canadian angle here. What is the problem? Let's say we get a bill where everyone has to vote to raise the debt limit. It's not a bill on the program. It's not a bill on a certain law. That we've already passed the program, like in the U.S. Supreme Court in Canada is fine with it, but then we have to vote on the dollar tag behind it. Because we all know, whatever it is, whether it's a military jet spending issue, whether it's the sponsorship issue, we all know the budgets balloon, they go crazy. Why can't we differentiate that, which would essentially be akin to a debt ceiling?
Well, we already do that. It's called the budget. And if the parties wish to vote against the budget, they can do so and force an election, at which point the people of the country can decide on whether
we know the budget implementation bill. But we know the budget implementation bill is not actually a bill talking about raising the debt. It's talking about all the other tertiary little things that you see in there.
Yes, it is. And I mean, I think people can pay attention to the media. I think the media has reported on it quite extensively. But at the same time, we've elected these representatives to make decisions.
Reported on the debt, or reported on that thing I said about how the budget bill is just a big mess?
Yes, I think there was extensive reporting on the size of the budget implementation bill and the size of it and the amount of spending that was
on the little
included
things there. People were worried about the Navigable Waters Act, but they weren't worried about the cost and the growth of the government.
I think people are worried about the cost and growth of the government, but under the current government, the Conservatives have increased spending, as you said, and I think that was the correct thing to do in the wake of the financial crisis. I think it's helped us grow out of the financial crisis, and it prevented it from being a worse situation for us. I mean, the Conservatives talk about reducing debt publicly. They chastise other nations for borrowing money. But at home, we continue to borrow money. But at the same time, I think our government is actually doing a pretty decent job of reducing deficits over the long term. I mean, deficits are going down right now every month, and eventually we're going to get back into the black. And I think what the Tories have done has actually been pretty responsible.
So you don't think, therefore, that there's any... I mean, when we look at the provinces, for instance, and I know we're getting to different levels of government here, but all across provinces, they don't have this. Municipalities, they don't have this. Federally, they don't have it. Again, no, aside from Alberta, has the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act, which, you know, I wrote about in my column. So there's no need anywhere to differentiate funding per se from these projects. Which is what makes it, because what I'm trying to get at here is I want there to be a national debate about debt. And you were agreeing with me that the budget implementation bills don't allow that because they're too bloated.
I think that the issue with having a national debate about debt is that people, generally speaking, are against debt. They're against governments borrowing money. As you wrote in your column, you know, people instinctually feel that they don't borrow money when they don't, you know, when they have a shortfall at home. So why should the government go and do that? But it's a different sort of situation for the government itself. I mean,
because they print their own money.
Yes, they can
set the interest rate.
Yes, and they can. And I think that that's a very advantageous thing for governments to be able to do.
They can inflate, they can conflate, they can do whatever they want with the money. But the bottom line is, in the end, they're still, if they're especially looking at one that ramps up the debt servicing costs and just the general proportion of government, they are still taking more money out of people's coffers. And that is the element that is forgotten in all of this conversation here, which is what I'm arguing for, which is what I want to see.
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that people are against debt, and they're for spending, and they're against new taxes. So this creates a major problem.
So politicians keep getting reelected by not highlighting the debt issue and highlighting how the spending is going to make all our problems go away.
I agree. So
that's why we're in the problem we're in today.
If we were to do
and this mechanism I'm proposing would slow that down.
If we were to do what you propose, which is to create a national referendum every time we were to raise the debt ceiling, people would always vote against raising the debt. So what would happen then? We would then default on our debts. Our credit rating would go into a tailspin.
You know that's not the only option,
and
though.
We would
You just said the Republicans and Democrats should sit down at the table and come to a compromise, which means clearly raising the debt ceiling is not the only option. The compromise can be gotten by, that word no one likes to say, but should be said, is cuts. It can be done.
I agree. And the debt ceiling hasn't done that in the United States, as we've seen. It creates this sort of crisis atmosphere where all of the representatives in the U.S. government get together late at night and make snap decisions to pass continuation bills. What the politicians should do...
It's done that a couple times, but it's not that. From 1996 until now, it didn't do that. So there's 20 years, 15 years where that didn't actually happen, where they did work something out, usually by raising it too much. So the big government people won.
I wouldn't say that the big government people won. I mean, we just had 8 years of Bush, and, well, he drastically increased spending.
Bush is a big government politician. I'm no fan of George Bush.
Okay.
I agree with you there.
Well, as I said, I just don't think a referendum on the debt is a good idea. I think it would lead to catastrophic problems for us. I think that it would lead to us defaulting on our debts, and that's not a good thing. I do agree that it's a good idea for our politicians to have a serious conversation about debt. And luckily, I think that is what's happening in our majority government right now. I think the Conservatives are concerned about the debt over the long term and that they're working to reduce it. And I wish the United States would adopt some of that thinking when they deal with their own debt issues, instead of having these crisis scenarios where they ramp up the rhetoric and talk a lot and don't get anything accomplished. I mean, it's time for America to address its long-term spending challenges, but they're not doing that. And I don't think a debt ceiling would help Canada address our debt issues either.
Michael Bullen, Huffington Post Canada, thanks so much. We're out of time, but thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, you can send me your thoughts on this and more. Do we need a debt ceiling? Do you need some say? Do politicians have to vote on money separately? That's the whole thing that I want to get going here. Anthony.Fury at sunmedia.ca. Stick around.